Last week, we told you about an elementary school in North Adams dealing with mold growth. Tonight, a school committee meeting was held to discuss what's being done to mediate the problem. Western Mass News reporter Olivia Hickey joins us live in studio with details.
Abby, I spoke with a parent who attended the meeting remotely. They learned that mold spore counts in the school were lower than the air outside.
These pictures and videos shared with Western Mass News were taken inside Brayton Elementary School in North Adams, days before the first day of school. Flash forward to Monday night, a special school committee meeting was held to discuss the air quality report conducted on the building. Superintendent Barbara Malkus sharing ways they plan to maintain a healthy learning environment.
We have added several new dehumidifiers to the area, to that room. We have certainly repainted and look to maintain a clean environment.
One parent tells us the issues in the district go deeper than the mold.
The lack of communication is a disease. The mold thing is a symptom.
Miguel Rodriguez and his wife's first grader attends Brayton Elementary. As a result, their student didn't start the school year until Rodriguez was assured by a third party the school was safe to enter.
Their lack of communication eroded the trust I had in them.
He tells Western Mass News parents only received one mention of the meeting at the bottom of an email about the air quality report last week.
We live in 2024 after a pandemic. There is absolutely no excuse when we have tools like Power School and what have you for parents not to receive regular communications of any important goings on at any time.
In the meeting, Rodriguez expressed his frustrations to the committee.
There does have to be some trust, and I agree with that. But it's hard for that trust to happen when the communication is very hard to come by. My concern is not about how is the school now. My concern is why are parents isolated from the process?
Rodriguez was offered the chance to speak with the superintendent on parent-district communication at a later date. In the meantime, advocating for parent involvement will remain on his agenda.
The only thing that would really address these concerns is some kind of, PTA would be the very bottom of the barrel thing, but some kind of parent group or parent advocacy that goes beyond the district.
Rodriguez says he and his wife hope to arrange a time in the near future to see the inside of the school and if things have changed since they first heard about the mold. Reporting in studio for Western Mass News, I'm Olivia Hickey.